Good evening and welcome back to the Savvy Street Show after a hiatus. We are on Riverside FM now and I have a guest again today. His name is Roger Bissell. He has been a professional musician for somewhere around 60 years, and for about 50 years he has been reading and writing on philosophy as well. So is the perfect guest for today's topic is music and objectivism. Roger is also an associate editor of the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies. Welcome to the show, Roger.
Thanks very much, Vinay.
Okay, let me see if we can start with a working definition of what music is. Can you give that to us?
Well, it's the form of art that's composed from the periodic vibrations of resonant objects or sonorous bodies. I noticed that the Harvard Dictionary of Music doesn't have a definition of music, so you have to wonder if they know what they're talking about. They probably do.
Okay, all right. Ayn Rand offered one in the Romantic Manifesto. There was an essay published called Art and Cognition, which I would call like a working man's definition. Does that work for us here today?
I think so. If you say that music is the art that's composed with periodic vibrations of sonorous bodies, and then you say, well, I don't hear any periodic vibrations of sonorous bodies, then it's not music. So you just negate the consequent, and then therefore you negate the antecedent, and that's how that works, right? You have to hear musical tones, which are how we experience those vibrations.
Okay, terrific. I want to take your mind to a recent study. I think it was a 2010 study by the Scientific American that was quoted there. And they analyzed well over 1 million songs. And they came to the conclusion, from the 1960s onwards, they came to the conclusion that in the 5 decades after the 60s, loudness had increased and melody and variety had decreased in popular music, at least. Does that sound true?
Generally speaking, yes. Everything is on a continuum. So I would say that there is some music that is not as loud as the average music from the 60s, and there is some music back then that didn't have as much melody as some things that are composed now. But generally speaking, they have done a survey, and I admire envy anyone who has that large of a database and the capacity to gather all that information. It's probably true, and if you wonder, well, why is that the case? I'd say it's driven by the market, and the market is driven by the culture, which is the values and interests that the consumers of music have adopted. So there's a chain or a trail of breadcrumbs from this study in Scientific American that has to go back to what values have the young people absorbed. I've heard people criticize music from the last half of the 20th century and today as being more primitive, being more primitivistic, simple. You can hear many exceptions to that. For instance, Burt Bacharach, who just passed away yesterday or the day before, he composed very enjoyable melodic and rhythmic songs, and he was greatly successful. And the Carpenters sang a lot of really great music. This, of course, largely in the 60s and 70s. And you don't hear very much music like that written today. You hear a lot more. They didn't have rap in the 60s and 70s, which to me is kind of poetry with a drum beat and a very simple musical pattern that repeats in the background. I remember when I was growing up back in the 50s and 60s, they would have beatniks or beat poets who would recite their poems while they or someone else played the bongos just to give a little bit of rhythmic accompaniment. And rap is more sophisticated than that. And some of it's quite virtuosic. It's like, how in the world do they spit out all of their poetry so quickly? Some of it's improvised, some of it's made up on the spot, which is very impressive. Wish I could do that. Not exactly like they do, but just to be able to be that quick on your feet and to compose something on the fly that has a coherence to it.
Rand did make that point that it's reflective of the culture going backwards, but she referred to a Helmholtz, German guy. And is there a way, we can show this mathematically between two songs? Just take a few songs from the 60s or 70s or 80s and a few from contemporary, and show that mathematically analyzing the patterns that, yes, the melody is less? Or is it just that, everyone has their favorites? My favorite decade is the 80s, and is it just a reflection of our age that we think, oh, that was the best music, or 60s were good? But by the way, I do think 40s, 50s, 60s were very good as well. Is that just completely subjective, or is there an objective analysis that shows, yes, here's what's gone backwards?
You asked more than one question, and I'll try to unpack it the best I can. Rand, in her article, Art and Cognition, which, goodness, she wrote that over 50 years ago. She proposed that someday musicologists or music theorists or whoever would do an analysis using, I guess, the computer. They'd gather a lot of data. To me, there does need to be a study of the components of music, but I think that the level of study or of focus may not be on the individual notes and patterns of notes, but maybe on the level of phrases and harmonies and progressions. I don't think that the effect that music has is on the subatomic level, as it were. I don't mean literally subatomic. I mean like gathering the notes and the frequencies and then that, like, there's some pattern that's going to jump out of us from an analysis of the pattern of frequencies. I don't think that's where we're going to find out where musical value is. I think we're going to look at melody and harmony and rhythm, and we're going to understand how each of those can be used to embody something meaningful about the world. I think we would analyze music ultimately the same way that we would analyze prose or like a novel's plot and dialogues and characters and so on, or the like. In other words, it's the level of analysis. I do think something like that could be done. To answer your question about whether it's objective or subjective, right now a lot of it is just, can you give a clever description of what somebody has written and how it's evocative or virtuosic or whatever. And that's all fine if that's all we have. Like you write program notes for the symphony, everything, or for the newspaper. But I think that there are people who have done this kind of analysis in little fragmentary sorts of ways, and that's what I'm interested in. If I had a university or a foundation's grant money and some little gnomes who would run the software and feed in all the songs, I could give you some really interesting stuff. And I think that's where it's at. I've done a little bit of this myself, but not in any kind of massive organized way.
Lovely. I hope you or someone else who's up to it does get a research grant to do an objective analysis of music, which, Rand said could be done in the future at the time. Going back to Rand again, she gave us a definition of art, which, I do think the Romantic Manifesto was in many ways perhaps her most insightful work. And that definition was a selective recreation creation of a man's or a human's metaphysical value judgment, and a selective recreation of reality. Would you agree with that definition?
Yes. Yes. I thought about that long and hard when I was young, and I thought, well, does it apply to music? What reality is music recreating? And some people say music is the language of the emotions. And they say it goes directly to the emotions, unlike the other arts. And I don't think that's true. I think that it goes to the emotions a lot like when you're watching a stage dramatization, like in a play. Rand made a very insightful point in... I'm trying to think of which of her essays, one of the first 4 essays in Romantic Manifesto. And she said that when we are responding emotionally to a character in a story, what we are doing is drawing a parallel, drawing an abstraction, some similarity between our own experience and what the character in the story is going through. And so it's, in a way, we are entering into the imaginary character's actions, events, relationships, and so on. And so our response is to what is going on as if we were undergoing it. And I think the same thing is true in, I wouldn't say all music. I wouldn't know if that would at all apply to Asian music, Eastern music, or to African music and so on. But I think it applies to the vast majority of popular music over the last 150 years, say, or longer. I think it applies to the vast majority of what we call classical music, which includes the Baroque, the classical, the Romantic, on up to at least the early 20th century before they started, splintering music into music that doesn't have melody or that doesn't have patterned, regularly patterned, graspable, coherent music. So I do think that a great deal of music from the last, say, 400 years does work a lot like the other arts. What is going on in the music, and you have to analyze it. You have to have some musical theory, ability, and knowledge and experience to go ahead and start picking apart the melody, to start picking apart the harmony and the rhythms. I'll give you some simple examples of what I'm talking about, because all this sounds like just a bunch of terminology. And the melody is the succession of tones that cohere, that hang together in a one unified pattern. The harmony is not successive, but simultaneous notes that are together, like a chord. A chord is a harmonic sound, and then the rhythm is the grouping together of sounds in a regularly patterned way, so that it helps to give coherence to how the melody unfolds. Melody and rhythm even if you had no chords at all, the melody and the rhythm would work together to provide that coherence, so that it's not just a jumble, so that it's not just a chaotic bunch of sound. So I'll give you an example now. This is an oversimplification, but we start simple and we build from there. And where I would start with, I would say that if you have music in a major key, that has a connotation of optimism. If you have a happiness or positive outlook, if you have music in a minor key, it has some kind of negative connotation, whether it's fear or anger or sadness or whatever. And then together with that's the harmony of the melody. In other words, if it's in a major key, the melody has that optimistic quality. If it's in a minor key, it's the pessimistic, negative quality. Then, if the melody is basically trending higher and higher in pitch, it has more of an aspirational or goal-directed, striving. I think that there's generally those words get the point across. And then if the melody is descending, then it has more of a settled, whether settled happiness or settled sadness. And angry music is more likely to be upward and minor, whereas tragic music is more likely to be downward in the melody and in minor. Heroic, triumphant music is more likely to be upward in the melody and in major, and jubilant, celebratory, joyous, happy music is more likely to be downward in a major key. So there you already have a matrix, as it were. Optimism, pessimism, striving, settled situation, before and after, as it were. Okay, so that gives you a lot that you can look at melodies. Now, no melody just goes straight up in la 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 la. You know, at some point it has a contour, as if you're looking at the diagram of the Wall Street Journal, not the Wall Street Journal, the New York Stock Exchange. Yeah, you know, because the stock prices go up and down, up and down, up and down. But every song has a unique melodic contour, okay? And you look at those things and you realize that there are patterns and that there are layers of structure. Like, I'll just give you an example. There's a song called My Heart Stood Still. And listen to what it does. I took one look at you, and all at once I knew, and then my heart stood still. So there were 4 phrases that were downward motion, right? But each one of them was higher than the preceding one. So da 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 da. So the downward motion of each little phrase, that was happiness, because this is in a major key. And the upward trend of the phrases was kind of a passionate building or aspiring or yearning. And when you listen to the words, you say, well, yeah, the words really fit the song because it's a romantic song. The guy is saying that all he had to have was one look at her and all of his romantic yearnings were lit on fire, basically. Okay, that's great. If you have the words in hand for a song and you can start picking apart the melody, for one thing, like that, you can learn an awful lot about, first of all, do the words and the music fit? And if so, then it was either a great songwriting team like George and Ira Gershwin, or a great songwriter like Richard Rogers or Irving Berlin. But these people, whether they did it, quote, instinctively or whether they studied it and were wizards who didn't give away their secrets, they were able to do this. They were able to know how the musical materials worked. And I don't mean each of the vibrations. I don't think they cared about the vibrations. I think they cared about how to structure melodies so that they did these patterns. Another example, I'll just give another example, a very different mood. A guy named Johnny Mercer, one of the great songwriters from the mid-20th century. Autumn Leaves, okay? The autumn leaves of red and gold. That's not the right words. Da 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 da. Now there's layering again. There's the melody goes up, but each successive phrase is lower in pitch. So you've got an upward movement on the phrase level, but a downward movement over 4 phrases. So you can see that you're stacking 2 different directions of motion, just like in the other example. However, in this case, it's in minor. It's a sad song. It's about a guy who has lost his love and he's remembering how sweet it was to be with her, but now she's gone. And since she went away, the days have grown cold. And soon he'll hear old winter song. And it's very, if you haven't heard it 200 times like I have, it affects you very deeply when you hear it. And it's a very well-written song. It's a work of art. It's a work of art where the words and the musical materials were crafted in such a way that it embodied, it communicated the emotion of sadness, and yet because on the phrase level it was upward, there was this yearning. Now the yearning is not. It's like the object of your yearning is gone. So because it's descending, that means that the yearning is blocked. It means that the object of your yearning was there, but now it's gone. And okay. I think that the lyrics of the popular songs back when they really knew how to write them and they just they cranked them out by the trainloads, the words are like training wheels for analyzing the emotional philosophical meaning of music. I think you can take
so they're consonant with the actual music.
Yes. All right. I think you can take these same insights, you could generalize and make principles out of them, and then you could carry them over to classical music where there aren't words, where there are just melodies and themes that are developed in big symphony pieces or string quartets or whatever. And you can't understand everything there is to know about music with this set of ideas that I'm laying out here, but you can understand a lot. I'll just give an analogy which might be helpful. Some people are very interested in personality theory, and I used to study psychology, and I thought it was really interesting and fascinating. And some people who have done an awful lot of study, like these Scientific American people who gathered a lot of data and then they crunch the data and see what patterns jump out of the data, right? Well, what they did was they had these long lists of personality attributes, and then they would try to group them together, and they found that about 50%, when they got the clusters down to 5, they could explain about 50% of the variation in personality from person to person. And there's a model now called the 5-factor model. And it doesn't explain every last detail about the human psyche or personality, but it gives you some really clear and powerful categories for understanding how people differ in their personality. I think the same thing is true about these kind of categories of melody and harmony and rhythm. you're not going to get the total fine-grained readout of music, but you're going to capture quite a bit of it.
Okay. I mean, what you're saying, excuse the pun, but what you're saying here struck you were saying just back then, struck a chord in me, if you will, as a novelist, because the structure of a well-structured novel or a screenplay has that kind of, ideally you have an A story and a B story. If it's not a rom-com, the B story would be the romantic story. And then you have to have increasing jeopardy, but you have to have falls, and the emotion has to go up and down for there to be effective, what we call in aesthetics, the cognitive science, transportation. Because if the story is ineffective, you don't get transported into the story. I mean, one of the experiments I did, my wife said, try watching a good movie that you thought was good with the sound turned off, which I did once with the subtitles on, so you can follow, and, so she can go to sleep and I can watch at night. But what happens is the background score is not there. So you can read the words, you can see the lip movements, maybe a very small volume, and the impact of the movie is much less, the transportation is less. And the other thing that struck me was you said, what you're saying is kind of that music is just like any other art. And Rand said, okay, but music is different because it goes direct to the emotions. But in fact, she also said that there is no such thing as a causeless emotion, especially a large emotions that we get from music. So I think what's happening is there is unconscious or subconscious. Probably, I'll say it is actually unconscious. I'll come to that in a moment, why unconscious, eventually. But there's unconscious or subconscious, both processing of the music, just like there is when you're in a drama or watching a drama or watching a play or watching a movie or reading a novel. And that unconscious processing leads to an emotion. So in that sense, would you agree music is no different from any other art?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, if we can make a basic distinction between the static arts, and that's no insult intended to sculpture and painting or architecture, and the dynamic arts. The dynamic arts unfold in time, and a novel is a story that unfolds in time, and the play, the stage play or the screenplay, it unfolds in time. Music unfolds in time. Dance unfolds in time. So when there are structural similarities between all the dynamic arts, and you were saying how to really respond to it, you have to be transported. You have to be drawn in to what is happening, so that you're almost vicariously experiencing it. You can't be detached with some kind of barrier between yourself and the artwork. It won't work as an aesthetic experience. So you have to surrender to the experience and let yourself be part of it.
Although you could, you can't. You can't analyze that piece of art and experience it aesthetically at the same time. You can do it afterwards or before. Okay.
That's true too. Multitasking is really hard to do. I get curious about things when I hear them, and if there's a lull in the action, then I start trying to pick it apart, and then I'll drift off into some thought process, and then I'll miss some of the dialogue in the movie or whatever, and I say, oh, I should pay more attention. But you pointed out that parallel between literature and drama, dramatic movies and so on, and music. There's another one that's very interesting, and this analogy between music and the literary musical analogy has been discussed for 150 years or more. And one of the things that music, especially since the time of Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven on for 150 years, is that music has a progression of action, and it leads to a climax. It leads to a peak of tension and then a resolution. And some songs have the peak around the middle of the song, some of them 2/3 of the way or toward the end of the song. But that's neither here nor there. The idea is that just as in literature, there are conflicts, there are things that need to be resolved, there are expectations that are built up and that are dashed, and then there are surprises and new directions and so on. And this happens in music, and this is objective. It's something that's really there in the music. And so, again, there's another part of music that we can point to, and we can say, well, it's not just my emotions. There are really these things going on in the music. There was a climax there. It built up to it. I think that when I talked earlier about the melodic contours with the notes going up and down, and they don't just go straight up, like even the example of do, re, mi from The Sound of Music. Do, a deer, a female deer. Re, a drop of golden sun. Me, a name I call myself. So you can tell where it's going, right? It's going upward, but it's da, 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 da. So even that has some pattern to it. It's not just like that. And so it's very aspirational. And even though they're just trying to get to the highest note of the scale, and she's teaching them a music lesson, and it's very cute. It's a very cute song.
Yeah, I love that movie. Actually.
There's Handel back in the mid 1700s wrote a Christmas carol we sing all the time called "Joy to the World," and if you listen to it, that first phrase is a pure example of what I was describing earlier as a downward melody in a major key. Joy to the world, the Lord has come. Right? It's like he's here. It's not like, oh, if only we believe and work strong enough, someday the Lord will come. Like someday my prince will come. Da 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 da. That's aspirational. The prince isn't here, but I hope he is someday. Whereas joy to the world, the Lord has come. Here he is. He's here. And then, let earth receive her king. So aspirational, let earth receive it. Okay, earth, this is something you have to do. You have to do something and not just sit on your thumbs. Okay.
So is it something
you
like,
can see, even on the level of the phrase, when it's well constructed, you can see how the use of the melodic materials in music, particularly, I haven't even talked about rhythm, but the use of the melodic materials really convey the meaning of the lyrics, or they work together well.
Yeah, it just struck me. I mean, Rand was critical of tribal music, and is tribal music lacking contours, and therefore, obviously, also?
Well, tribal music tends to be more repetitious. It tends to be more cyclical rather than, I would say, goal-directed.
Hawkins recites, or tells us, informs about, rather, in his magnum opus in 1976, where he said even a newborn baby, if you did an EEG over the brain, then what is happening is when you play music, it's the right brain that lights up. And when the baby hears speech, it's the left brain that lights up, the left hemisphere, rather. So, music is a right-brained activity, but that's only, in modern research says, that's only when it comes to listening, it's primarily, and responding emotionally, it's primarily a right-brained activity. But the construction of music, the composer and the post-facto analysis would be left-brained. Does that make sense?
Oh, of course it does. And I think you can see the analogy like in a stage play. Like if a baby was sitting with the parents in the audience and the evil, manipulative researcher had electrodes hooked up to the baby, as the baby watched the action of the people on the stage, I would imagine its right brain hemisphere is lighting up like crazy. And then when they start, and if they stand still and they start to talk, then the baby's left hemisphere is going to light up. So I really think that music with words is an interesting case, because are you listening to the words as speech, or are you listening to them as a marriage blending with the music? I would think that if you had a poorly written song, which with words that did not fit the music, that a person listening to it would have a lot of activity going on between both hemispheres. Whereas if you're listening to a poem like by Emily Dickinson or Longfellow or Whitman or somebody, that's probably more right brain, even though there's language going on. It's not speech. It's more patterned flow of evocative language, as opposed to the baby, the mama is saying, "Well, now, sweetie, would you like a cookie?" Well, that might be music to the baby's ears, but it's not poetry. So,
Jaynes,
I think that Jaynes, what he was talking about, sounds very plausible to me.
Okay, I think he would agree with you on the second part. On the first part, he would say, try this experiment, and I haven't tried it. You plug in 2 earphones in your 2 ears, but link to 2 different songs, one that you haven't heard before and you're not familiar with, that the first word and the first note, you know what it is, kind of thing. And he said, you listen to them for a minute or two, take them off, and you will remember if you're a right-handed person, then your right hemisphere links to the left ear. And what was in your left ear, the music that was in your left ear, you would remember it better, which I presume is both the lyrics and the melody, everything.
I think that's probably true, and I'll tell you why I think that's so. My understanding is that our spatial awareness is for right-handed people anyway, is on the right hemisphere. And music is, even though we think it's sound, what does that have to do with space? But music is very positional. The notes occur it's even how it's written on the staff. Those notes have positions which mean higher or lower, and you learn where they are on your instrument or your voice. So I think that when we hear music, it's in what's called auditory or sonic space. There was a fellow named Edward Lippmann who did his doctoral thesis back in the 50s. It was called Sound and Space. And he delved into the physiology and so on of how sound could come to have attributes that were analogous to spatial location. But he convinced me, this is an old thing. I don't think it was ever published as a book, but it's fascinating to understand how something that started out in fish as a lateral organ for sensing the depth of by the difference in pressure, they could sense what depth they were at, and they would go up to the surface or go down.
All right.
And eventually it turned into an organ for handling vibrations, air vibrations that came to it. And the inner mechanism of the ear has places where each of the different frequencies vibrate the ear mechanism, and it's all laid out on some kind of grid in the brain. And I wish I understood it better, but I understand it well enough to know that it makes a lot of sense to me why musical perception would have a positional character to it in addition to simply being pleasant sound or lively or irritating sound or whatever.
Okay. No, it certainly seems to have a position in the brain itself. And like we said, in the case of the newborn baby or the fish, it's more the unconscious, pre-programmed response. But then there's programming that we do to our own bodies and our mind as we grow. And then there's the subconscious response, to make that distinction clear. I mean, this is the Jaynes I was talking about, Julian Jaynes, Princeton psychologist. And he then delves into an extremely that part of his is not controversial. The right brain, left brain. It's been tested millions of times. But he then delves into a controversial hypothesis, which is that music is used to kind of get you emotional, therefore reduce your critical faculty. And we say that even in storytelling. Good stories that transport you lower your critical faculty at the time, and therefore you're more amenable at that stage to the messages being given by the artist or the director of the film. And music, Jaynes implies, was used by organized religion to bring more people into the fold. It's an instrument of organized religion, not solely, but it was used like, and it can be used like that, because music lulls you into obedience, in a sense.
Well, the architecture of the cathedrals and churches, the ones that didn't look like Viking longhouses anyway, the ones that had spires and the great statues and stained glass windows, those were aimed at impressing and drawing in the people. So I do think that the arts were used to attract the people and say, you're really getting something more than just sitting and listening to somebody drone on at you for 30 minutes. You're getting something important when you come in here. You're getting a full experience. You're getting music, you're getting architecture, you're getting painting. This is to be a glorious, enriching experience, and I think they got it right. I think that whenever we gather together to celebrate, we should celebrate with good music, good storytelling, good art. I do think that there is a seductive power to it, and I know Jaynes was saying it's a way of it's like Marx said, religion is the opiate of the masses. I think Jaynes was in a way saying music is the opiate of the masses.
The key drug used by religion. I mean, he asked for a baby to sleep, and I think he was hitting there. There is the pre-program unconscious level, then there's the subconscious level.
If you want me to answer that, I would say the best way I found to put a baby to sleep is to drive around with the baby in its car seat until it falls asleep.
Yeah. It's rhythm.
The regularity and the rhythm, the regularity of the constant soothing motion or sound may be just all there is to it.
Okay, now one last question. Are you planning, can we expect a book-level treatment? Because this is such a big topic, even just music and objectivism. You could write volumes on it. Are you planning a book on it anytime, or do you know of a book that you could recommend?
I have many books I could recommend, but I don't want to talk about other people's books right now. I have a working title, and if I know what's good for me, I will write this book. It's called Serious Schmaltz and Passionate Pop. And it's going to be about why the Great American Songbook songs stood the test of time, and why the best-loved classical themes and melodies from the last several hundred years, why they have stood the test of time. that they have certain strengths and powers of representing our feelings and emotions and views of life and the world. And I do intend to do it, and I'm going to try to give enough examples that people won't feel that I'm just cherry picking the ones that support my theory, but that they can see that, oh, this makes complete sense, and maybe give them some tools that they can use on their own when they get curious about, why they like a particular song. And maybe it's as simple as that's where they first made love in the back seat of a car and they heard the song on the radio. But hopefully people's musical tastes are more than just nostalgia, that they are, and there's nothing wrong with this nostalgia, but I happen to like country music and rock music as well as I like classical and jazz. I like everything. It's like the old commercial about give it to Mikey. Mikey will eat anything. Well, I will listen to anything if it's good. I will. I will. And if it's trash, it doesn't matter. You asked me one time about the recently, is it even decent music anymore? Some of it is, and some of it's horrible. There was a song 20 years ago called, and I think it won the Grammy or the Emmy or something. It was called, I think it's called "His Heart Out There for a Pimp." And my wife and I were watching this on the tube, and there are these people come out with these Crayola-colored ghetto costumes, and the prostitutes and the pimps and the pushers are all dancing around singing this song, and we're just horrified. It says, oh my God, Western music is dying.
Well, we will conclude on that note, but I would certainly welcome you to go ahead and do the book. You are the right person to do it as an artist and as what you call yourself, the post-Randian objectivist. So thank you for being here, and that brings us to a close on episode number 14, Music and Objectivism. See you soon.
Thanks, Vinay.